to the fourth webinar of the National Public Health Week 2022, the Physical Activity webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about physical activity and mental health well-being. I first of all would like to thank all the collaboration partners that helped to set up this webinar: the Florida International University, the Universidad de Antioquia, Medellín, Colombia, America's Network for Chronic Disease Surveillance, and of course the main organizer, one of the main organizers, the physical activity section of the American Public Health Association. Today about mental health and benefits of exercise. As maybe some of you are well aware of, that there are a lot of benefits of physical activity on mental health, like natural mood boost, improves confidence. But for instance, some of the most important thing, if you compare, like have a look at my personal experience as playing tennis or playing hockey, it helps me a lot to maintain like my strength to work or for daily life. It's for me like a natural energy boost. It helps me to avoid like stress and mental fatigue. It's also helps me in be more focused and for motivation. I feel less angry, frustrated if I hit the ball correctly, of course. And it also, most important thing is like having fun. So this is just my personal experience, which is not a randomized controlled trial, but really my personal life visit is very important and helps me to balance things pretty much out. Now, there's also some more official information, like there's an interesting study that was published a year ago, the Move Your Mental Health report by John W. Brick Mental Health Foundation. And they summarized the evidence of thousands of studies, and they basically concluded that movement activities should be integrated into mental illness treatment, early intervention prevention, as well as building and maintaining mental wellness and resilience. They also mentioned that the majority, almost 90% of all the publication in the journals, they report a positive association between physical activity or exercise and mental health and well-being. They also mentioned that some forms of mental health challenges, such as depression, anxiety, they have more evidence, where some others like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have a bit less scientific evidence. But the vast bulk of scientific evidence has basically revealed the positive influence or benefits of physical activity and mental health. This is again for those to remember how much should we have of physical activity per day. An average adult, older adults, we need between 150 and 300 minutes per week, recommended at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. Every minute counts, so you can take the minutes from whatever daily activity you do. You don't have to do them 30 minutes in a row. You can do 10 minutes now, 5 minutes later. Just try to make sure you get to 150 minutes. Then usually the older you get, you need a little bit more. Alternative ways of exercise, like multi-component activities for balance training and strength. Everybody should have at least 2 days a week of muscle strengthening activities, but this is basically what we should do. And I really hope that everybody of us will try to reach these targets and to improve their health and maintain a healthy quality of life for as long as possible. And having said this, it's my pleasure to present you a speaker of today, Tom Kane. He is Secretary and Vice Chair of Strategic Partnerships and the Secretary of the American Public Health Association's Physical Activity section. He's also the Treasurer of the Mental Health section of APHA. He's also an editorial board member of the Journal of Physical Activity and Health between 2017 and now. And he's a member of the American College of Sports Medicine Active Earth Task Force in 2021. It's a great pleasure having you here, Tom, for this webinar. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Let me see if I can find my presentation here. difficulty pulling it up.
No problem. Take your time.
Yeah, it's pulling up Google Drive, which is not where I want to be. Do, 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 do. Yeah, I'm sorry about this.
No problem. I'll send it to you in the chat as well. You can download from there as well.
Yeah, no, it's defaulting to somewhere other than my drive.
Okay. But if you like, I sent your presentation in the chat as a document. You may download it from there. It may work.
It's not letting me. Access. My hard drive. Which is unusual.
I can share it at my end, no problem.
Yeah, could you do that?
Yep, here we go.
There you go.
That's the correct one, right? Good.
You're gonna have to move the screen for me.
Yeah, just let me know when next, and then that's
Good. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for sharing some of your valuable time with us today in celebrating National Public Health Week. And today is actually World Health Day, so we get a twofer. We're going to spend a little bit of time on physical activity and mental health. We could spend hours, if not days, on this. But it is an important topic, and it intersects, two of my major interests, and so I think that's important. If we can go to the next slide. So this is pretty basic, but I'd like to start out and just highlight a perspective that I have on this definition of health, which is taken from the preamble to the Constitution of the World Health Organization. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. I think, and I hope that we've all seen this before, and hopefully we've used it during the course of our practices or professions. A point I'd like to highlight, this is stated in the conjunctive, not the disjunctive. And the way I'd like to view these three concepts is through the perspective of a Venn diagram, where you have an overlap that really highlights the critical juncture of health in the three concepts. And ideally, you'd like that overlap to be complete, so you only have one circle, because they each relate to each other, and you can't have one without the other. And so you get that full confluence in the Venn diagram. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in the context of how physical activity relates to mental health. Could we go to the next slide, please? This may be the most important takeaway from the slide deck and from the presentation, but I think it's a great quote. Physical inactivity is a key modifiable risk factor contributing to the scandal of premature mortality among people living with severe mental illness. Physical activity and exercise has been shown to reduce mental health and symptom severity and the likelihood of experiencing future episodes. From a public health perspective, where we're always so focused on prevention, when you can identify a modifiable risk factor that is a key one, it obviously starts the process of being able to engage the population that you're dealing with in a critical public health activity. And becoming physically active as opposed to physically inactive is not that hard to do. And the benefits are, believe me, from a mental health perspective, extremely large. Next slide, please. So we're going to address, the mental health effects briefly, from first the acute effects and then the chronic effects. And as Noël indicated in his introduction, much of the research in this area and much of the literature addresses the intersection between physical activity and depression and anxiety, two of the more prevalent conditions, mental health conditions, because of the prevalence and the ability to study it. It gets more difficult as you get into more serious mental illnesses. There are a lot more challenges, and really from a research perspective, and you're also starting to deal with more comorbidities, which just confounds everything that you might want to tease out of your research. So we'll focus briefly on depression, anxiety, and cognition. Immediately after engaging in physical activity, individuals exhibit an improved mood and reduced anxiety. I think just anecdotally, we can all relate to this. Notably, a single bout of exercise can reduce anger, confusion, depression, and tension, and can leave someone with a sense of having more energy. And again, anecdotally, if you've ever been in a situation where you're angry or confused or depressed, and you go out for a long walk or even a short walk, a long run or a short run, you come back feeling better. The literature supports the fact that there's a correlation between that exercise and your mental health. Scheduling physical activity over the course of the day can result in enhanced mood and increased cognitive benefits during the day. And we know that from a pure physical activity perspective, moving throughout the day, being less sedentary throughout the day is something that's recommended and even encouraged. But it not only has physical health benefits, it also has mental health benefits. And finally, on this slide, demonstrated cognitive benefits seen immediately after an exercise session include better memory, better mental processing speed, and better executive function. Next slide, please. In terms of the chronic effects, and I'll refer to the American College's guidelines throughout this presentation. They align closely with the physical activity guidelines for Americans that was put out by the HHS and the CDC's recommendations. I'll just refer to the ACSM's recommendations. Their recommended physical activity guidelines for adults of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity has been associated with a 22% reduction in the risk of incident depression in adults and a 21% reduction in the risk of incident depression in older adults. And older adults are important. They're very susceptible to depression. Keeping them active also reduces the risk of suicide, which is pretty high in that population. Engaging in physical activity has been associated with a reduction in the risk of experience anxiety. And again, either coming in from a run or going out for a run, and measuring your anxiety levels both before and after gets you to this point on an anecdotal basis. Those who engage in higher levels of physical activity are 26% less likely to develop anxiety when compared with those who are less active. And engaging in regular physical activity contributes to the prevention of psychological distress and alleviates enduring episodes of depression and trait anxiety. And I think that's important because you see in the literature research dealing with both studies that deal with symptoms of depression and anxiety, as well as actual diagnosable conditions of depression and anxiety. And you get a benefit from physical activity on both of those dimensions of the particular mental disorder. Next slide, please. Importantly, and this is a very important current topic, a recent study found that individuals who were active versus those who were inactive were statistically significantly less likely to have thoughts of suicidal ideation. Meeting the ACSM physical activity guidelines produced a statistically significant protective effect against suicidal ideation. And again, if we're talking about public health and prevention, having an activity that provides a protective effect is obviously something that akin to the gold standard that we would want to resort to. Conversely, not meeting ACSM physical activity guidelines has been associated with a statistically significant increase in suicide ideation. And so you get both sides of the coin when it comes to this issue. You reduce the risk of suicidal ideation and ultimately suicide. But if you're inactive, it flips off going the other way and you increase your risk. And that's obviously something we would want to avoid. Next slide, please. Briefly, I want to talk about a couple of mechanisms with respect to physical activity and mental health. The first bullet here, I think is something everyone is familiar with. When you are active, you increase your blood flow, and that produces associated benefits, increased flow of oxygen in the blood and nutrients in the blood, delivery throughout the body to the brain. And so it enhances directly brain health from that perspective. Two other, I think, maybe less known, well-known points. Physical activity produces, your body produces brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which has an impact on brain health, including neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Primarily in the hippocampus is the area of the brain we're talking about, which is the area that primarily deals with memory. BDNF also has a number of other benefits to brain health and health generally, but those are two key ones. And I should note that there is some discussion in the literature whether or not BDNF does this directly or is a mediator. I think it's less than clear. But in any event, in the chain, the causal chain, or the causal link between physical activity and brain health, BDNF is a necessary factor because it is a factor. Less known, and this goes to some of the important recommendations in the physical activity guidelines. The osteoblasts, which are your cells in the bone that produce bone matrix, when they're healthy and they're producing bone, produce osteocalcin, which has almost nothing to do with bone health. It relates, it has an impact directly on memory and certain intellectual functions. And so when we talk about the physical activity guidelines and the resistance exercises that are part of the overall guidelines, separate and apart from the aerobic exercises that all of the guidelines call for, doing resistance exercises strengthens your bones, and that in turn helps the bones produce this protein osteocalcin, which again is directly related to brain health. And there are at least some studies out there that would suggest that even in Alzheimer's patients, when they look at those patients compared to a more normal control group, they have much less osteocalcin circulating in their body than more normal people do, which is another indication of how important physical activity, keeping your bones healthy by exercise, is important to brain health. Next slide, please. I want to briefly turn to athletes and mental health for a second. There's been a lot of publicity surrounding this issue in recent years. And many people on this call, but many people involved in physical activity more generally, deal with athletes in sports and sports-related activities on a regular basis. And there are some special challenges with respect to athletes and mental health. Noted on this slide, Simone Biles and her struggles in the last Olympics, which were a slightly different twist, and I'll use that term, with intentionally. Her mental issues were more performance related than maybe other issues that we've seen, like depression and anxiety, that are psychological or psychiatric, but they are still mental health issues that are important to an athlete's performance and success. And she managed to work through her issues before the end of the Olympics and actually performed. Kudos to her. But that's one aspect of mental health in athletes. We've all seen, hopefully, Naomi Osaka's struggles over the last year and a half with respect to her mental health as she has tried to get her tennis career back on track, and the brave efforts that she has to actually talk about her struggles, to put a spotlight on them and to help people understand that this is a real issue and it's important to everyone. I put the Russian Olympic Committee figure skating team on this slide. I don't think anybody who saw the finals of the women's figure skating contest and the meltdowns that happened, particularly with respect to the Russian Olympic Committee figure skating team, and notwithstanding what you may or may not think about the issues surrounding the potential doping related performance issues, you had to understand that the women that were impacted by the decision, just looking at the TV screen, are going to be impacted mentally for some time to come. And last, and sadly, the incident involving Katie Meyer, the recent incident who was a goalie for the Stanford soccer team, and it was reported that she recently committed suicide. Not sure why, but certainly when young people, tragically end their lives that way, it has an impact on our broader audience, whether it's sports-related audience or the more general public. But those are some issues related to the mental health in the headlines. Next slide, please. Common issues associated with mental health of athletes, personality issues, and the psychological response to injury and illness. This is particularly an area where sports psychologists and certified management performance consultants play in terms of sports teams and athletes. The athletic culture and environmental factors, including sexuality and gender issues, hazing, bullying, sexual misconduct, and transition from sport issues. Eating disorders and disordered eating, depression and suicide, anxiety and stress, overtraining, and ADHD. And I want to just highlight one aspect of eating disorders and disordered eating, particularly with respect to adolescent females, you will often see adolescent females participating in sports or sporting events or athletic activities in a very intense, focused, and strenuous way. And I know that some people take that as a sign of a driven athlete, but oftentimes, notwithstanding the fact that they may be driven athletes, their drive to push the limits of physical activity are actually masking the existence of an eating disorder. And they are using the physical activity as they might with other, bad habits and bad activities to further the results of their eating disorder. And so coaches, trainers, team doctors who may not be psychiatrists, need to be very careful when they deal with all young athletes, but particularly young female athletes, to make sure that they're not missing an important, evidence of pathophysiology, that psychopathophysiology that needs to be addressed as soon as possible. And so just because someone is exercising does not mean that they're healthy, which is basically the message here. Next slide, please. Interestingly, in one of the major medical journals within the last week and a half, there was an opinion piece published by a psychiatrist who is strongly recommending that because of the combination of the result of brain injuries plus the abnormal behavioral problems that can result from participating in sports and athletics, that there needs to be more involvement of psychiatrists as part of a team sports effort. And the psychiatrist or a sports psychiatrist would be in a better position to be able to evaluate substance use disorders, eating disorders, mood and anxiety disorders, and have a better understanding of the relationship between the athletic environment and the potential interventions that could be administered to help the athlete along the way. That's a very important point, and it certainly needs to be considered. I would say that given the scarcity of trained psychiatrists, trained mental health professions, and the crisis that we've seen in terms of the being able to reach care on a regular basis in everyday activities, that devoting the resources of a psychiatrist to team sports is probably unrealistic. But it does highlight the importance of paying attention to these issues in athletes, and the importance of trying to address issues earlier than later when it's possibly too late to do anything that is practically realistic. Next slide, please. So the recommendations here. The physical activity recommendations for mental health are generally the same as the recommendations for physical health. Obviously, if you're already regularly engaged in physical activity, keep up the good work. And if you have a problem or an issue, consult a qualified fitness professional or your healthcare provider if the occasion arises. If you're starting a physical activity regimen, consult with a qualified fitness professional at a minimum before beginning that regimen. And obviously, if you have a pre-existing medical condition or a psychological condition or known risk factors, you should always consult with a qualified fitness professional or your healthcare provider before beginning that regimen. A qualified fitness professional should know the red flags that are present in order to refer someone, a potential future client, to a healthcare provider before they start an exercise regime. And so making sure that the fitness professional is qualified will help ensure that the exercise regime will not do more harm than good. Next slide, please. More recommendations: encourage movement and physical activity over sedentary activities. And, you know, previous presentations over the course of this week have talked about why any movement is better than no movement, and the importance of keeping active throughout the day. You know, meeting the minimum ACSM recommendations for physical activity for healthy adults is probably the best recommendation. In the current ACSM guidelines, as Noel indicated in the introduction, a minimum of 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic physical activity per day for 5 days a week, or a minimum of 20 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity per day for 3 days a week, plus activities that maintain or increase muscle strength and endurance that work all major muscle groups for a minimum of 20 minutes a day on 3 days a week. And as I noted earlier, it's important to keep your muscles and your bones strong because they directly impact your mental health. Walking at a relatively brisk pace can qualify as moderate intensity physical activity. Even as little as 10 or 15 minutes of aerobic exercise in a single session can produce improvements in mood, and a single session lasting at least 20 minutes can produce even more improvements in mood and anxiety. And as always, it's important as professionals to tailor movement and physical activity recommendations to the preferences of the client, athlete, patient, which will go a long way to ensuring that whatever is recommended will be something that they want to do and that they will stick with. Next slide, please. Further recommendations: advocate for active transportation policies, programs, and projects with your legislators, policymakers, and regulators. Walking is a great, way to get your physical activity in, but having your city, your town, your village designed properly with policies in place that encourage that is important. And in terms of the design, advocate for enlightened urban design policies, programs, and projects. And also importantly, include with your advocacy an ability to incorporate green spaces that are conducive to mental health. This is a fairly big deal these days. There's research going on that shows that there is a very good link between being exposed to green spaces during your physical activities and your mental health, and being able to provide green spaces within urban design policies is important to promoting mental health as well as physical health. And I would also advocate for adequate funding and resources for your local parks and recreation districts, which are a great resource for physical activity for people of all ages. They're usually, if not almost always, free because they're part of a city, village, town's budget. But maybe their budgets aren't enough, and their budgets aren't enough to accommodate the ability of those places to be safe. You can have a great park, but if the neighborhood around it is not safe and nobody can go to the park, then there's less of an ability to be physically active, and that's important in terms of being able to encourage physical activity, especially in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. Next slide. And these are my references. Slide 1, slide 2, which leads to the question slide.
Thank you very much, Tom, for an excellent presentation to provide us an overview of feasibility of mental health and also some suggestions what we can do. I encourage everybody to write your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button. We have 3 questions received so far from the participants. You're welcome still to write us questions, and we're going to address them as we have enough time. Good. The first question. Has research said anything about the direction of the association between physical activity and suicidal thoughts? Is it because physical activity can help so much people struggling with mental health issues that suicidal thought reduce? Or is it that people with suicidal thoughts feel so bad and have no energy to do physical activity?
I think, and I think this was kind of covered on the slide that dealt with this. It is actually a bit of both. That, you know, the bi-directional basis of the prongs of your question, I think kind of go both ways. As I said when I covered the slide, I think I said it on that slide. It's really the two heads of the head and the tail of the same coin. Related to that thought, and I'm not a suicide expert, I do know that when you put time and distance between your thought and your ability to act, that you reduce the urge to act on your impulse. And if you are feeling bad and you go out for a walk or a run and you're predisposed to having these thoughts, you can kind of put some distance between the thoughts and your ability to want to act on those thoughts. You know, that's my perspective. I would have to go back and look at the research and the literature to figure out if that's right. That's my impression from looking at this issue now some time ago.
Thank you. The next question. Have you ever had a situation where the material you discussed today related to your personal experience?
Well, I discussed a lot of material. So I would say that I personally have struggled with an eating disorder in the past related to physical activity. I managed to get over it. It took a while, but I was, you know, personally, I was exercising the heck out of my body, and it turned out I was doing it for all the wrong reasons. I did look at that issue in more depth when I was doing research for a doctoral program that I was involved with several years ago. And the literature seems to be fairly clear on that point. But that's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 more questions, so people on fire. Next question. How would you address that many female Olympic athletes experience amenorrhea due to the toll of training on their body?
Well, that's a good question, and that goes to the female athlete triad that is discussed quite often now in the literature. This is a reason why, yes, there is female Olympic athletes being at the top of their game, being driven to be the top athletes in the world, obviously place their bodies at great stress, which results in potentially destructive mechanisms from a physical perspective. I think this is something where coaches, trainers, and even family and friends can play an important role. because there needs to be an objective check on the ability of some of these athletes to recognize something that they can't see, and to be able to maybe back off, train a little bit different, and get truly professional help that will allow them to achieve their goal, and yet save their physical health.
Thank you. Then James asked, for sports psychiatry, has anybody identified anything competitive stress syndrome? How much is this due to self-expectations, peers and coaches, disregarding fan or parental approval?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It means for sports psychiatry, has anybody identified like apparently competitive stress syndrome, and how much a competitive stress syndrome is due to self-expectations, peers and coach pressure, I guess.
I mean, I haven't sat down with the DSM-5 lately, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I do know that that is a huge issue, and while you put aside parents, I think parents are part of the problem, especially with younger kids. You know, I obviously think this is covered by a number of the other recognized disorders that is in DSM-5. But there are nuances on that, and I don't personally believe that the DSM-5 is the be all and end all of mental disorders. I think there needs to be a more nuanced, and it may be a starting point. But particularly when it comes to athletes and competitive athletes, there needs to be a more nuanced understanding of what the athletes do and how it's impacting them. And I do think that, you know, all of those factors come into play that you've identified. But I do think, and I've dealt with young athletes in the past on at one point in time, a pretty intense basis. And I can tell you that the biggest stressor in their lives was coming from parents. And that's unfortunate.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary. Have you seen any differences in the protective factors of physical activity depending on whether it was done indoors or outdoors? Wondering if there are additional benefits to move outdoors or practicing physically outdoors.
I think this depends on in part upon the person and where they're comfortable with. You know, I go to the gym and I see people walking on the treadmill, and I wonder, you know, why aren't they doing that outside? It's a really nice day. And you know, where I live, we got this really big space called the National Mall, and a really big space next to my house called a national park. And I personally would prefer to be out on the mall or in the national park. But some people either want to exercise indoors, or they have to exercise indoors because they live in a neighborhood, for example, that's not safe to walk outside. I think you get a benefit from walking through green space that you wouldn't get, say, walking indoors. And I touched briefly on the importance of green spaces. I haven't personally seen any research that distinguishes between the two. And I think the really important point is you're moving and doing all the right things. And as long as you're comfortable, whether it's indoors or outdoors, you're pretty much 98 or 99% of the way to achieving your objectives.
Thank you. We have time for two more questions. Diana asks, first of all, thanks for your presentation. And she would like to know if, in your personal experience, if you have found any research regarding the relationship between socio-emotional competences and physical activity.
I think that there is research out there. Certainly how you feel and how you feel what others are feeling towards you will go a long way to deciding whether or not you want to do something. And so, you overlay the whole social behavioral health paradigm on top of physical activity. And whether it's the health behavior model or the trans-theoretical stages of change model, all of those models come into play when you're actually advising or recommending physical activities with respect to clients, patients, or athletes. And so, yes, I think that there is a fair amount of, especially qualitative research on this issue that places importance on being able to address those issues to get someone moving in a way that they are comfortable with, that they will keep on doing.
Good. And our last question, I mean, if you're obviously, if you can answer that, what types of screening tools for anxiety and or depression would be recommended for an initial client assessment?
I mean, there are tools out there, and I'm not gonna, I don't have the names of them off the top of my head. I know that general practitioners use a 3-question screening tool for depression. It's fairly simple. It can be done in an office by a GP or a family doc or even a pediatrician. The fitness professionals have a rather simplistic template that they use in order to screen, potential clients. But I'm not a clinician, so I won't say any more on what you do when you want to diagnose or potentially diagnose a condition.
Okay. Thank you so much. There were many questions, so thanks for addressing them all. And with this, we will conclude our lunchtime webinar for today. Thank you so much, Tom, for your talk and for answering all the questions. Thank you for all attendees, participants, for taking your time. We have recorded this session and the recordings will be made available for everybody probably 1 or 2 weeks when we're going to disseminate the links of the webinars, not only this webinar, but all other webinars we had this week. I also hope they're going to join us tomorrow. Tomorrow we have the final webinar of a webinar series, which will be an interactive workout session in your office. So you connect yourself by Zoom, and we are going to be physically active and having a guided workout in the office. It's probably going to help you to reach maybe the 30 minutes of physical activity per day in your office every day. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you tomorrow. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Louisa, for helping setting this up.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Be safe.